If you want to feel more connected to humanity and a little less alone, listen to Beautiful Anonymous. Each week, I take a phone call from one random anonymous human being. There's over 400 episodes in our back catalog. You get to feel connected to all these different people all over the world. Recent episodes include one where a lady survived a murder attempt by her own son. But then the week before that, we just talked about Star Trek. It can be anything. It's unpredictable. It's raw. It's real. Get Beautiful Anonymous wherever you listen to podcasts.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'm your host, Peter Zablocki, and you're listening to another bonus episode of the Today in Context series, where I provide some historical context to the things happening in the news today. So let us talk about the suspension of Jimmy Kimmel Live by ABC. But first, let me preface this by saying this is not a political episode by any means. It's just one that looks at the historical context of a current event. At the core of my sources for today's script, among many different websites, are the Harvard Law Review 2021 article, The Non-First Amendment Law of Freedom and Speech, as well as Linda R. Monk's 2015 book, The Words We Live By, The Annotated Guide to the Constitution. I highly recommend the latter. It is always on my desk as a really handy reference. But while I have you, and before we dive in, make sure you check out this week's Conversation Series episode, where I speak with America's storyteller, the renowned filmmaker Ken Burns, where we discuss his newest documentary series on the American Revolution. Well, now let us look into the historical context of the whole Jimmy Kimmel firing.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941,
it's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The roots of freedom of speech in the United States trace back to the Enlightenment ideals that animated the framers of the Constitution. All of this culminated in the First Amendment's ratification in 1791 as part of the Bill of Rights, or the First 10 Amendments. This amendment boldly proclaimed that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. The provision was a direct response to the tyrannies of British colonial rule, where seditious libel laws had silenced critics of the Crown. And it also enshrined a radical vision of an open marketplace of ideas, where even unpopular or offensive expressions could flourish without any government interference. Yet from the outset, this freedom was tested and tempered. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 criminalized false, scandalous, and malicious writings against the government, leading to the prosecution of over a dozen journalists and highlighting the fragility of the principle amid partisan fears during the quasi-war with France. The Civil War era brought further strains, with President Abraham Lincoln suppressing Northern newspapers critical of the draft and emancipation, while the post-war Reconstruction saw the Supreme Court in cases like Ex parte Milligan from 1866 begin to set limits on executive overreach. The 20th century sharpened these contours through landmark jurisprudence. In Schenck v. United States from 1919, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously articulated the clear and present danger test, upholding convictions for anti-war leaflets that could incite insubordination during wartime. It was a standard that was later refined in Brandenburg v. Ohio in 1969 to protect speech unless it incited, and I quote, imminent lawless action, end quote. It was a threshold that shielded even the KKK rallies from outright bans. Meanwhile, New York Times Company v. Sullivan of 1964 revolutionized defamation law by requiring actual malice for public officials to win libel suits. This fortified press freedoms against retaliatory lawsuits and enabled robust political satire. These evolutions reflected a maturing democracy grappling with the speech's dual role as both a bulwark against tyranny and a potential spark for chaos. All while private entities like publishers and broadcasters navigated their own editorial discretions unbound by the First Amendment's government-centric shield. Now enter the Federal Communications Commission, more commonly known as the FCC. The organization was born from the Communications Act of 1934, amid the radio boom's chaotic spectrum scramble. It was tasked with allocating airwaves as a public resource and preventing monopolistic interference in an era when AM signals could blanket the entire continent. Unlike print or digital media, broadcasting's scarcity justified regulation. The FCC licensed stations under the public interest standard, mandating diverse viewpoints and prohibiting obscene, indecent, and profane content during hours when children might be listening. A policy galvanized by the Supreme Court's 5-4 ruling in FCC versus Pacifica Foundation in 1978. That case upheld a $2 fine against George Carlin's Filthy Words routine aired on WBAI radio, deeming it indecent for a midday broadcast, despite its comedic intent. The FCC's fairness doctrine, enforced from 1949 until its repeal in 1987 under President Ronald Reagan, compelled broadcasters to air contrasting views on controversial issues, fostering a veneer of balance, but often chilling, edgy discourse. Its demise unleashed the talk radio partnership of Rush Limbaugh and later Fox News' ascent. Today, the FCC wields fines up to $500,000 per violation for indecency. Kind of think of Bono's fleeting F-bomb at the 2003 Golden Globes, which sparked an actual $550,000 penalty. However, I should mention, it was later waived. But this entire reach stops short of pure political opinion, as affirmed in cases like Red Lion Broadcasting Company versus the FCC of 1969. In this case, the court upheld the agency's role in promoting discourse without endorsing outright censorship. This regulatory tightrope balances the First Amendment's absolutism against broadcast's unique public trust obligations, allowing satire like Saturday Night Live, for example, to exist. In the shadow of these precedents, the indefinite suspension of Jimmy Kimmel Live by ABC on September 17, 2025, mere hours after the FCC chairman Brendan Carr publicly shunned the host's monologue remarks about the assassination of activist Charlie Kirk, crystallizes the tense interplay between protected speech and permissible repercussions. Kimmel's September 15th segment lambasted the MAGA movement's politicizing Kirk's murder, accusing Trump's allies of hypocritically mounting a man they once dismissed, while ignoring the shooter's manifesto echoing their own rhetoric on election fraud. It was a biting satire that conservatives decried as inciting hate and misleading the public. Legally, however, Kimmel's words fall squarely under the First Amendment protection. Political commentary, even if laced with sarcasm or hyperbole, cannot be criminalized unless it meets Brandenburg's incitement bar, meaning imminent calls to violence, which Kimmel's monologue did not do. Courts have long shielded comedians from liability for offensive hypotheticals, especially since Hustler magazine versus Falwell, a case from 1988. The FCC lacks authority to cancel a show over opinions. Its indecency rules do not target partisanship, and Carr's threats of regulatory scrutiny against Disney, who is ABC's parent, smack of viewpoint discrimination, potentially violating the agency's own neutrality mandates, and inviting lawsuits, especially under laws which bar FCC censorship of programs. What would be illegal here would be overt FCC fines for non-indecent speech or government coercion of private firings, echoing unconstitutional prior restraints, but we haven't seen that yet. ABC's move, however, and it needs to be mentioned here, is lawful as a private employer's prerogative to mitigate advertiser flight or boycotts, much like CBS did in 1960, axing a Nixon interview for perceived bias. This polarized moment, with Trump hailing the suspension as a talent purge and late-night peers like Jon Stewart decrying it as chilling authoritarianism, the episode really highlights the speech's vulnerability, not to outright bans, but to economic and regulatory pressures, reminding all of us that true freedom thrives when public airwaves resist the siren call of enforced balance at satire's expense. But as is the case with all these Today in Context episodes, to see how this ends, we just have to wait and see.